This is Free to Exchange, the show where free markets and free-thinking scholars meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. Good manners often dictate not talking about religion and politics in polite company. But we're going to break that rule of thumb today by discussing the political economy of religion itself to start the show. Then, on the second half of the show, we're going to discuss the Austrian School of Economics and what unique insights it might have about money, business cycles, socialism, and a number of other issues. My first guest is Dr. Anthony Gill. Dr. Gill is a professor of political science at the University of Washington. He's an expert on the political economy of religion and the author of 2 books, including The Political Origins of Religious Liberty. Tony, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
So, to start with, maybe could you explain, when we say the political economy of religion, this does sound dangerous, like mixing politics and religion. What is meant by that?
Yeah, well, it's the 2 things you're not supposed to talk about at parties. I made a career of doing. But economists have always had a problem with religion.
Gets you lots of invites, doesn't it?
It does, and lots of disinvites. But it's interesting that a lot of economists have wrote off religion as a topic for inquiry because it's faith-based or something like that, and it's not amenable to rational calculation. But as I point out to a lot of them, religious people, pastors, clergy, people in the pews, they live in a world of scarcity. They have to make choices about how to allocate funds to the youth group versus a missionary organization. What are they going to do with pews and different things like that? So they live in a world of scarcity, and they do have to make choices about how to best further their mission.
Sure. So just like anybody else, then they're going to respond to information and incentives around us. So could you give us an example maybe of a religious practice or something that's done where it might seem odd if we were thinking about it just as faith, but once we take account of incentives, how it works?
An economic puzzle that doesn't seem rational at the outset, but turns out to be is a great place to start. And there's a really good one with religion. And the question that often comes up is, why do Mormons send missionaries out when they're 19, 20, 21 years old, knocking on doors when the church really knows that to get a convert for a cold call is almost impossible, less than 1 in 1,000.
I've had many knock on my doors and it never really converted me.
It doesn't work that way. So the question becomes, why would you take 2 individuals who are in the prime of their life and send them basically on this impossible task? Well, this is where the economic analysis comes in. The Mormons, the Latter-day Saints, run a really great social welfare institute. Their churches, if you're in a ward and you get into an accident, the whole ward circles around you and helps you out. So it's a big, what we call, collective action problem. And a collective action problem can be solved if everybody in the group cooperates. If there's people who free ride and want to get out of the group, just want the benefits, but not have to pay the cost of coming to church every week and donating, tithing at 10% or that, the organization will fall apart. It will crumble. It will weaken.
Right.
And so
this would be the classic of everybody's taking out but not enough for putting in.
Exactly, right? And one of the economic things that we often look for is, how do people solve this? And the Mormons have done an incredible way of solving this using the missionaries. By sending people out on missions for 2 years in foreign countries, knocking on doors, getting the doors slammed in their face, oftentimes being harassed.
To be clear, I've never slammed the door in their face.
No slamming here either, but I've talked to many missionaries, and it's a tough job, right? But here's the thing, that if you go through that for 2 years and come out on the other end, you're probably going to be very dedicated to the organization. The people who do that for a few months and say, whoa, this is not for me, is not going to be the person in the church who is going to be rallying around somebody who is hurt in the ward and paying their tithes and all that kind of things. So it works as this wonderful filtering mechanism to find out who's going to be a free rider. If you're going to be a free rider, please move on. And who's going to be a loyal member. The loyalty rates of Mormons are just out of the world when it comes down to this.
Because they all get sorted out at the beginning when they're 19, 20 years old.
Exactly.
So is this something unique about Mormons because just their church is so generous and comprehensive in things that it provides people, or do you find other examples like this?
There's a lot of other examples, and I'm working off the research of Larry Iannacone, who's a great economist of religion, and a great paper he did on sacrifice and stigma and solving collective action problems. So he mentions the Mormons quite a bit, but there's other groups as well. The Jehovah's Witnesses have similar technique of just knocking on doors and talking to people. Other groups exclude certain types of behavior. They make you wear strange garbs and hats that differentiate.
That's not a strange hat here in West
Not
Texas.
a strange hat here, but out in Washington, must think I belong to some kind of religious cult or something. But they have different groups will have different ways of doing this. And actually, out here you have a lot of Baptists in West Texas. And one of the things that the Baptists do is they prohibit drinking. You got to be dry if you want to do that, and then cuts off a lot of other opportunities that might exist outside of the group for you. You can't go out and have a few beers on Friday night with your friends and things. So it binds you closer to the group, and it also acts as a signaling mechanism saying, hey, are you going to be a loyal member of our congregation or not? Here's a test.
So actually, let's stick with the Baptist example for a minute here and the drinking, because it sounds a little bit different than the Mormon one. There's a similarity, right? That we're going to do some costly thing to signal that on other margins, when it's costly to us, we will go ahead and still cooperate. Mm-hmm. But then there's like an extra sorting mechanism with this one of who you're going to associate with.
Right, there's the added benefit too, as you create these sacrifices and then also stigmatize yourself in the general population. Who can you hang out with? Well, the people within your own group. And so the group solidarity is strengthened not only by the initial filtering, but also by the closure of your social network.
As I'm hearing you say some of this, it's striking that, and maybe it shouldn't be because it's just economics and it's everywhere, but that these things aren't unique about religion. It's religion picking up on mechanisms that are used in lots of other contexts in order to solve these problems. And I'm thinking about, we're sitting here at Texas Tech University and we have fraternities and sororities.
Fraternities and sororities are perfect examples. In fact, I had a student when I was teaching my religion and politics class come to me and says, Professor Gill, this sounds just like the fraternity. All of our hazing that we do in the first few weeks of school and the rush week and singing strange songs and doing all these odd rituals, is that a method that we're using to filter out people who are not going to cooperate? I say exactly. A fraternity relies on a lot of cooperation of individuals to make everything work. And you want to know who are going to be the cooperators and who are not. So if you do some crazy thing for 2 weeks and you decide, I don't really want to do that, okay, you go on your way. But the person who does, you probably know that they're going to be a good cooperator down the road.
This is like you have worked on some of these other things where it's part of civil society too. And a lot of civic clubs we see around town, there's some that will have crazy hats and things like that you mentioned.
It's ubiquitous, and this is one of the things that I love the economics of religion, because you can focus on something that most people don't think is related to economics, that's religion, and then start applying it more broadly, like these civic associations that we talk about. If you've ever heard of the Elks Club or the Moose Club or the Shriners, they're organizations that rely upon a lot of cooperation. So who are we going to get to cooperate? Who are going to be the free riders? How can we filter them out? They do a lot of crazy things. They wear strange hats and parades and ride around in cars, or they have rituals where you have to dance with moose ears or something like that. And some people say, well, that's crazy. I don't want to belong to that. And the group says, okay, then you probably don't want our other things.
And historically then, where these came from, they were providing lots of benefits similar to what you described from the Mormon Church, right?
Exactly. David Beto has done incredible research on these, what they call friends societies, wherein these Elks Lodges or Moose Lodges, Friends of Eagles is the one out by us, provided health insurance for individuals back in the 1800s, before large-scale insurance markets really kind of came into being. A doctor would come around every month or so, and everybody would come in, and that's a great opportunity for people to chip in a little bit of money, help to insure one another, pay for a doctor to do regular checkups. But it's also an opportunity for free riding. People could just come in and say, I'd like to be a member on the day that your doctor comes. But you don't want those folks, so how are we going to filter those folks out? Here, dance around in this moose hat for a while and do some crazy things. And if you're willing to do that, you know what? You're probably a good member of our group now, so we'll cooperate. And
of course, these have now evolved as government has kind of come in and crowded them out in many ways, so that now they don't quite have the dedication to some of those practices, but you see some of them remain.
Yeah, that's actually one of the sad things. Out by our house, we have a Friends of Eagles Club, and it used to be very vibrant and thriving. It's now filled with a lot of older individuals. It's largely a social club, a drinking club, but these groups really did serve their purpose at one point in time. And you're absolutely right. When government comes in and subsidizes a lot of these different types of insurance activities, these civil society groups disappear. And it's kind of sad. You also see a lot of this with church organizations as well that used to provide similar services for other individuals.
Let's bring it back to religion then for the last couple of minutes here, because it seems striking to me as you're analyzing the incentives of this, that this has relevance for people thinking about not the Muslim religion generally, but particularly like radical Islam and terrorism that's associated with that. What does the political economy of religion say about practices there?
Yeah, there's a great scholar down at UC San Diego, Ellie Berman, who's done work on this using this framework of sacrifice and stigma. And he notes that radical religious groups are actually associated with lots of extreme behaviors at times, terrorist behaviors, because terrorism is an activity that you need to have a cell of individuals who are going to be highly trustworthy amongst themselves. Because if somebody defects and goes to the police and says, hey, we got this terrorist thing being planned here, the whole group falls apart. So you need to have people who are completely loyal to you. How can you filter those individuals out? Well, religious organizations oftentimes provide this. This is why many radical political organizations will piggyback on religious groups in order to serve their mission. He analyzes this not only in terms of groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, but also Jewish radical groups that were prevalent in Israel, and then I shouldn't say prevalent, but existed in Israel in the 1970s and 1980s.
So to be clear, what you're saying on this, it's not something inherent in the religion that leads you to be terrorists. It's if you're going to create terrorist act, you need some mechanism of enforcement, and religion is one of the things you can latch onto to solve your own problems.
That is the perfect way to state it. It's not necessarily in the theology, but the rituals that religions have oftentimes used to filter out free riders and to enhance cooperation are the exact same ones that can be applied to any other type of cooperative effort, either a very good one, providing health insurance, or alternatively, one we would consider being very bad, of attacking civilians.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you for joining us today. Don't go away. When we come back, we're switching gears and we're talking money, banking, business cycles, and more.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Joseph Salerno. Dr. Salerno is a professor of economics at Pace University, the academic vice president of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, and the editor of the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. And it's the uniqueness of the Austrian School of Economics that we're going to talk to him about today. Joe, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here, Ben.
So for 4 years we've been doing the show, and on the set all the time we have this little statue of Ludwig von Mises, and we often have books here, but we've never really discussed what Austrian economics is. And often it comes up in various ways in topics that our guests discuss in the show. What is the Austrian School of Economics?
Well, I think the basis of the Austrian School of Economics is the focus on the individual. The individual's wants, desires, and preferences are really what drives everything that we see as economic phenomena. So the skyscrapers in New York City that house commercial businesses and so on, those things are objective, but it's ultimately the demands of consumers exercised on the market through their purchases or lack of purchases of various products that determine all of the capital that we see, determine all of the uses of land we see, where labor is located. So to sum it up, it's really subjective values of individuals that through action and choice brings about a pattern of economic activity.
Yeah, so it's the interplay of all of the people's subjective valuations, both of costs and benefits, that create the entire structure around us.
Exactly, everything that we see.
So actually, for clarity then, the Austrian School of Economics is not about the economics of Austria.
Absolutely not. Though it was started by economists that were natives of Austria. The primary economist or the founder was Karl Menger, and one of the things that he said is that man, in a generic sense, is at the center of all economic activity. It's man striving to satisfy his wants that causes all the economic phenomena that we see.
And that's in the late 19th century.
Yes.
And then Ludwig von Mises, our statue here, he comes around in the early 20th century and has a circle around him.
That's right. So he was considered the third generation of the Austrian school. He was a student of Menger, an economist named Baumgartner, and Mises wrote a treatise, a great treatise on money, and it was in the early 20s that he started what was known as the Mises Circle, and there he took very brilliant graduate students. He had a circle of them around him, and other economists, and even invited economists from outside of Austria. And that went on until 1934. And there really developed modern Austrian economics in that Mises circle.
Yeah, and in the context of the debates that he started having, both Mises and his student Hayek in the 1930s, right?
That's right. But you might want to just step back. He really set off a debate on socialism with a book he wrote in 1922, based on an article he wrote in 1920, basically pointing out, making a very simple point that, look, without market prices, there's no way to know how to allocate resources efficiently or even rationally. Mm-hmm. And then later on in the 1930s, that actually was brought to Great Britain and other the U.S. That whole argument by Hayek, and the debate. There was a debate in Germany in the 1920s, but in the 1930s, the debate then became a debate in the U.S. and in Great Britain.
And this is where the Austrian school starts to distinguish its uniqueness, stemming from that interplay of people's subjective evaluations of their understanding of the economic process different than the professions, or other schools of thought within the profession.
Yeah, I think it was at that point in the early 1930s, the mainstream of the profession included the Austrians, but then the mainstream began to hive off into focus on general equilibrium, which is sort of a system of equations that attempts to explain economic activity, and also to focus very narrowly on specific markets, where the Austrians were always focused on the economy as a whole, as well as the specific markets, but always on the interconnectedness of it. And since they were talking about action, they couldn't really describe the analysis in terms of a system of equations.
Yeah, and so this kind of leads me to somewhat of the unique aspects of Austrian insights now into economic processes. And the other debate, of course, that happened in the 1930s was about macroeconomics and business cycles. You have the Keynesian revolution comes in, but Mises and Hayek had an alternative view, right?
Yeah, so Mises and Hayek, as opposed to other economists, especially after 1936, Keynes's general theory was published, they believed that it was a failure of spending, an absence or an insufficiency of aggregate demand that caused recessions. And then they had a very simple solution. Have government pump up the money supply, push down interest rates, encourage spending that way, or have them run deficits and directly increase spending in the economy. Mises and Hayek said no. In fact, the problem to begin with was with a distortion of a very important price that is really embedded in every market in the economy. That price is the interest rate. So when new money is created by the central bank, their point was it's lent out through the banking system, and that depresses interest rates below the natural rate that would make supply of voluntary savings equal to demand. And so then that sets about entrepreneurs or causes entrepreneurs to mistakenly think there's more saving available. Mm-hmm. And as a result, they begin to invest in a lot of longer term projects that will never pay off.
And the Austrians were developing this in the context of the Great Depression that was going on, right?
That's right.
And so what would be their recommendation in light of this when you find yourself in a depression? And how does that different from, say, the Keynesians that you mentioned?
Yeah, what the Austrians said was, look, if you want to prevent it, don't tamper with the interest rate, don't increase the money supply. But if you're in the depression, then the best way to get out of it is not to try to reflate the money supply, not to try to increase money and push prices up. It's not to try to prop prices up at high levels and keep wages up. It's to allow those things to fall to natural levels. And at that point, people at lower wages, there'll be more profits to be earned by businesses, and therefore business will restart itself. Slowly at first, but then after a while, it will return to a normal situation.
So it's a recognition that kind of in the boom beforehand, all of the capital structure got distorted and out of whack. And their prescription is to realign it all.
Yes. And it takes a while to realign it all because a lot of capital has been destroyed, a lot of buildings, electricity, and so on are used in the wrong, or were wrongly built to begin with, or overextended, and they're used in the wrong areas. So they have to be restored to some sort of a pattern that reflects the subjective values of consumers.
Yeah. Now, in the business and financial community, Austrian economics started getting a lot more attention in this last decade, really, since
Yes.
the boom and bust in the United States. Do you see parallels to Austrian cycle theory with what happened here in the Great Recession?
Yeah, well, I actually do. I mean, what I see going on was, and I wrote a paper on this, was that from 2002 through 2005, Alan Greenspan and the Fed increased the money supply to get us out of the previous depression, which was the bursting of the dot-com bubble in 2000, 2001. So what he did was consciously, and you can look at some of the things that he said, and some of the writings by people in the Fed and by Larry Summers, consciously start a housing boom. In other words, drive the price of houses up and also of financial assets, because then there'll be what the Keynesians call a wealth effect. That is, people will feel wealthier. Their houses will have a higher value. Their 401ks will be more valuable, and therefore they'll begin to take money out and spend money and get us out of that previous recession that we had in 2001. Bottom line, of course, is that that's not the way to cure depressions, and by setting off that housing bubble and then eventually sort of the financial bubble in general, we had a situation where they eventually burst when they throttled back on increasing the money supply.
Yeah, and it would make sense that this would flow into housing as one of the places that's kind of interest rate sensitive, right?
Yeah, sure. It's very interest rate sensitive, and then there were also laws passed in the 1990s that encouraged a lowering of credit standards with no documentation loans, liar loans, where people's credit ratings were not counted, previous credit ratings and defaults and so on were not counted against them at all. So yes, it was, we don't know in any given situation where the new money is going to flow into, but where it does, it will distort that sector.
And what do you think about the long kind of recovery that we've had from the Great Recession here? And how does that relate to policy errors that were undertaken in response once they got themselves into this situation?
Yeah, well, it was hardly really a recovery. What we had was just all of this unconventional monetary policy that drove interest rates very, very low, flooded the economy with money, and in the midst of that, we also had large costs that businesses were worried about, like from Obamacare. So basically, business became frozen, and so we didn't get a robust recovery. Okay, we're still really feeling the effects still on the labor market of this very slow recovery. I mean, look, the recession officially ended in 2009, and we still aren't back to a robust labor market.
So in the last couple of minutes that we have here, related to recession and money, because money is a very unique part of Austrian economics as well. A lot of people in popular circles tend to be interested in gold or the gold standard, and how does that relate to anything that you've been saying about business cycles or Austrian economics?
Well, the gold standard is a way of anchoring the money supply. In other words, it was sometimes called the golden handcuffs, which meant that you handcuffed the government so that they couldn't deficit spend. If they wanted to spend more, they had to raise taxes. They couldn't just print money to do it. So the gold standard is a way of preventing business cycles, or what's now called macroeconomic fluctuations, because it keeps the money supply very tight, very tight. It changes over time, but very slowly.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today and informing us a little bit about some of the uniqueness of Austrian economics.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
On today's show, we had two what seemed like very different topics: the Austrian School of Economics and the economics of religion. But actually, if we think about it, we can tie them together. Our second guest told us how the foundation of all of economics is the interplay of people's subjective valuations of costs and benefits while they interact with each other in a marketplace. And when we think to the economics of religion, it's really just that: individuals with subjective valuations informed by their religious beliefs who interact with each other in a world of scarcity, which means economics is there too. In fact, economics is everywhere, as you see often on this show every week. We'll see you next time.